Exile sucks, even if it's sunny. I should know, as I ended up in Malta for the better part of a year due to the UK Conservative government's regressive and unjust immigration policies. And so I'm pretty thrilled to be recording this intro on the 5th of July 2024 from a newly de-Tourified country, even though I'm not exactly holding my breath that the new government is going to do anything to address said regressive and unjust immigration policies. I do realise that whining and or moping about having to spend time in a Mediterranean apparent idyll could come across as at least somewhat spoilt. So I feel annoyed with my own hypocrisy and lack of self-awareness when I judge others for not having a bit more self-awareness, as I did during and after watching Nostalghia, a late work from Russian cinema's most revered director. Haha, sorry Sergei Eisenstein, but you're just slightly too propagandary to get the nod from me. As it happens, I was at Russian-British comedian Olga Koch's show this week, which was part of the annual Oxford Comedy Festival. Her set was centred around grappling with privilege and all that comes with it, both good and bad, and being separated from people you care about. It's funnier than it sounds, I promise. These themes got me thinking back to watching Nostalghia, talking about it with Lyn, and also thinking that I should finally get my act together and release this episode. Nostalghia makes Stalker seem action-packed by comparison. It's a film about exile, as I said. It's a film about longing, or toska, if you prefer a Russian approximate equivalent. It's a film about burning your bridges, amongst other things. It made me think stuff and also feel stuff, and that's what art's meant to do, right? It's a film I found both relatable and alienating, which I'd argue is a pretty neat, if not exactly pleasurable, trick for it to have pulled off. Can I promise that you'll have a good time watching Nostalghia? No. Can I promise that it'll make you think stuff and also feel stuff? Also no, but I'd say the odds are pretty favourable. And hey, it's Tarkovsky, so you can pat yourself on the back for having the good taste to dedicate a couple of hours of your finite earthly existence to watching it, even if it wasn't exactly fun. And so, on that cheery note, I bring you the hopefully long-awaited return of a quote-unquote normal episode of this show. Oh yeah, and we're maybe doing slightly sardonic cold opens now.
Please, Tatiana, hear me.
Вот скажи мне, американец, в чем сила?
А вы что, собираетесь на ней жениться?
Да.
Ух, красота-то какая, лепота.
Таможня дает добро.
И вообще не называй меня, пожалуйста, Вероникой. Кто я? Вот кто я?
Отныне русская земля — единый быть.
Don't torture me, I can't live without him.
Hi, my name's Ali Pitts, and this is the Russian and Soviet Movie Podcast, where we discuss Russian and Soviet films and films with a Russian and or Soviet connection. As always, I am joined by a guest, and today it is the magnificent Lyn Seren returning for the umpteenth time. I didn't bother to count how many times he's been on. It's a lot, and all of those episodes are pure gold. So hello, Lyn. Thank you for joining us.
Wow, that was the most hyperbolic introduction I've ever had in my life.
Yeah, no pressure or anything. No pressure.
Nope. None whatsoever.
So, for guests who haven't had the fortune to have heard a previous episode that you're on, is there anything you would like them to know about you, or would you prefer to remain a man of mystery?
I don't know. I try to give off like an air of mystery, but I don't know whether I succeed in being very mysterious. But yes, it's a pleasure to be back.
Great. So I'm gonna take that as a as a tacit yes, remaining mysterious. Okay, great. If you want to find out more details about Lyn, listen to the previous episodes that he's on. You might find some stuff from those, although
that's
I promise
true.
Nothing.
Well, we used to live closer to each other, and now we live farther away. So
yes,
it's more mysterious, I guess.
Yeah. You live in a secret and mist-filled land, much like the films. Try that again. Much like the lands featured in this film, maybe. In fact, there was a Garth Marenghi's Dark Place alluded to the predominant weather of the country you're in. Is that giving too much away?
No. You can say that I live in Scotland.
Okay,
it's fine. It's fine. I have an acquaintance that lives in Brazil, and he was talking about how nice it is in the winter at the moment because the cat comes up and slits with him or whatever. And I looked up the weather, and it was like identical to the weather in Scotland. And here we are in summer.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Well. I don't know why I was affecting an incredibly bad Scottish accent to say "oh well" there, but never mind. That's yeah.
No, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful day. It's the first beautiful day we've had for, I want to say months, but it's nice.
So it's living up to the stereotypes.
Yeah. When we first moved here, like the first time we were here was really nice, like consistently. And then this year in particular, and last year to an extent, it's just been pretty miserable weather-wise, but it's okay.
Yeah, it's something one knows about when moving to Scotland, I suppose.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. It's
it
accurate.
has many things going for it, not necessarily
It
the
does,
climate.
not necessarily the weather, yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to thank you for a thing on air, because I think I've thanked you on episodes I've recorded, but haven't thanked you in person. Thank you for putting the Saint Audio Podcast Festival on my radar, because I might have missed it because I'm not always the most observant, but you saying that they'd mentioned it on the Flophouse was very helpful, because then I knew that it was happening near me and was able to go and get involved and all that.
Yeah, right. It looked pretty cool, and I was like, I don't know whether I can get down to Oxford for it, but yes, hopefully it's been fun.
Yeah, it was really good. So if you're a Flophouse listener, dear listener, and you listen to the Spice World episode, somewhere in the laughing at all the jokes is probably me laughing. So I don't think I laughed loud enough that you'd pick me out, but just know that I'm there somewhere in the ambient noise. Right. So I should stop talking about other podcasts and other films and other things, but the St. Audio Podcast Festival was awesome, and if they do it again next year, and you're in the vicinity, dear listener, get along. It was awesome. Right, so the film that we are discussing today, dear listener and dear Lyn, is hope you watched it in preparation for this.
Yes.
Awesome.
We haven't said the title yet. I'm a bit worried.
We haven't.
I was like, yes, I've definitely watched the film. That you decided to change the film at the last minute.
This is where I switch it up and say it's something else. But no, I'm not going to do that. Yes. So the film we are watching is Nostalghia, or Nostalghia. I
hope you're going to let me get away with saying nostalgia. I was like, otherwise I'm just going to offend someone.
You don't have to say
okay, cool.
Nostalghia the whole time. Yes, so it is an Andrei Tarkovsky film. In fact, it's his penultimate film. So if you haven't seen it before and you don't own it on any kind of physical media, dear listener, and you'd like to check it out, then you can find it on the streaming platform Classicy. And Classicy is available in the UK, the Republic of Ireland, and the US. And because we're extremely well connected here at the Russian and Soviet Movie Podcast, we have a 50% discount on an annual subscription. So if you give it a go and decide that you really like it, then you can use the promo code RUPOD50, that's RUPOD50, to get 50% off an annual subscription. So they have lots of amazing cinema on there, but they have the last two films by Andrei Tarkovsky. So that's this, Nostalgia, and his last film, The Sacrifice. So yes, that is where to find the film if you'd like to watch it. So, right, a few things then about Nostalgia before we jump in and talk about it. So it's from 1983. It was shot in Italy. This is after Tarkovsky had moved there. He left the Soviet Union. There was supposed to be support for this film from Mosfilm. However, they pulled out for some reason, and then the film ended up needing support from different companies, but it still got made in the end. You can tell my research on this particular bit of the background is a little sketchy, but yeah. So it has themes of exile, which we'll get into in a minute. So we will have a spoiler warning soon. Well, this is I guess the first spoiler warning, but we'll have another one, and also a content warning. So this film deals with themes around mental health, potentially relationship infidelity, and most particularly suicide. So if you're listening in the UK, we have the organisation The Samaritans. I also know a sizable chunk of our listenership is in the States. So there's a bunch of different organisations, but I know that 988lifeline.org is a useful one. If you're listening somewhere besides those two countries, then do look up the International Association for Suicide Prevention's directory, as that will give like a local organisation or local organisations. I'll put links to all of these in the show notes so you can find those if that's relevant to you or someone that you know well. I just thought it was important to flag rather than saying, oh yeah, go and watch this Tarkovsky masterpiece and then be totally blindsided by some potentially upsetting or triggering content. So yes, content warning given, I suppose. Right, so Lyn, as you're well versed in the process over here, what is it that we say when we're going to launch into the discussion of the film?
Paekali.
Yes. Sorry, it's been a while, so I should have checked.
I know. As soon as you started that sentence, I was like, ooh. But thankfully, like you said, like I've done it enough.
Yeah, no, I do apologise. Oh my goodness, yes, it has indeed been a while. Yes, so we say that as that was what Yuri Gagarin said when he was blasting off to become the first man in space. And to be honest, at this point, it's a gimmick I kind of regret doing, but the forms must be observed. So, oh, and it means off we go. So it's a logical thing to have when you're launching into something, but. As a gimmick, I've grown a little tired of it, but hey, we're still doing it because, as I say. Oh my goodness. Right, so we count down from 3, 2, 1. Paekali! Amazing.
Thanks.
Lyn and I have just watched, okay, we haven't just watched, that's a fiction as well. We've notionally just watched Nostalgia, or Nostalghia, and this is the super big spoiler warning. If you don't want to know what happens in this film, you've been warned. Please pause the podcast, watch the film, come back. Otherwise, we're going to ruin it by telling you about it, if that's a thing that can happen. So, before we discuss it in depth, Lyn is very kindly going to provide a thumbnail sketch of what happens. Over to you.
I'm going to attempt to. So, as far as I could wrangle, what? Yes, the plot. So there's kind of two parallel plots going on. The main one, I guess, the one in colour. There's one in colour and there's one in black and white, and they sort of overlap, particularly at the end of the film. So we've kind of got the colour one, which is about this Russian guy who's been living in Italy for a couple of years, researching some composer. He's a poet, but he's been researching composer in Italy, in some village somewhere near Bologna, possibly. And he's initially there with this woman, but then she leaves him, whatever. And he's wandering around being sad and missing Russia, and just mulling over how sad it is to be in this lovely Italian village, and how it's all very washed out. And then there's a kind of black and white plot that we keep cutting to, which it turns out, as the film goes on, was sort of 7 years... No, it wasn't 7 years in the past. It was in the past. And for 7 years in this village, this guy, to try and wait out the apocalypse, had locked himself and his family in this house in this village for 7 years. And this guy still lives in the village. It's not clear whether he still lives with his family, but he definitely still lives with his dog. And now he just lives in this half-abandoned house where the roof is collapsing. And eventually the Russian guy and this guy meet. And then the Russian guy starts seeing in mirrors and stuff, he starts seeing himself as a mirror of this guy that locked him and his family away for 7 years. And then the last half hour of the film, 20 minutes of the film, he ends up in Rome, and it looks like he's about to leave, but then he's got to do a thing, and then he gets a phone call.
This is our Russian translator.
The Russian poet guy,
yeah.
So
sorry, not translator, we'll get onto that in a minute.
Yes, so he moves to Rome for the last bit of the film, and then the woman that he was with at the start that left him calls him, and it's one of these mysterious rooms that only seems to exist in films, where there's just a desk and nothing else in this giant room, or only in Italian films, so maybe they just exist in Italy. Maybe in Italy everyone's sitting in giant rooms with desks, just desks in them. Yeah, and then the film ends, pretty much. I'm sure I've missed lots of details, but there's not a huge amount of plot.
Yeah, there really isn't. So it's just over 2 hours. So this is, relatively speaking, for Tarkovsky, at least compared with Solaris and Stalker, a concise film. But it feels quite long because of the... I feel like ponderous is an overly freighted word.
I think that's fair. I think it does feel ponderous. There's a lot of pondering. Yeah.
So, character name wise, Goncharov is the Russian guy.
Is his name Andrei?
Yes.
Appropriate. The subtitles spelled it differently to Tarkovsky, but I didn't see it on screen, so.
Yeah, that's one of those transliteration ones, because obviously it's... English has several different systems. Italy has its own system. It's originally in Cyrillic, so it will come in different ways. Then the older Italian man who locked his family away for 7 years, he's Domenico. I
don't think I caught his name. I'm very sorry.
No worries. And then the woman her role is she's a translator.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not sure I caught her already. It's just that he was sleeping with everything. But
yeah, although that's sort of a little ambiguous, but I'm sure we'll get into that. She's called Eugenia.
Yes. Yeah. Did catch that.
Yeah. So, I think this is the 6th out of 7 Tarkovsky film that I've now seen. Where are you at, Tarkovsky-wise?
I think this is my third. I think I've seen the other two. I think I saw with you. So I've seen Andrei Rublev and I've seen Stalker. Okay. I don't think I've seen Solaris, and I don't. Have I seen another one and I've forgotten about it?
So his last one is Sacrifice, and there's
Definitely
also
not seen it.
Mirror.
Nope.
Okay.
So I think it's those three. I think it's those three that I've seen now.
Because for me, this, in a weird way, feels almost, but not quite, like either a slightly meta remake of Stalker or like a sibling film to Stalker, just because, not in terms of plot, but in terms of imagery, just so many things, just so many even like location setups and just framing devices and just stylistic choices of just like, I've seen this before and I know it was you, Tarkovsky. So yeah, was that just me, or did you kind of...
No, definitely felt like that. To me, it felt like What If Stalker, but more boring. Okay, more boring is kind of unfair. I mean, like, less mysterious. Like Stalker, like, not that much gets explained either. But part of the reason that Stalker is, like, really compelling, a lot of it, is there's a lot of people standing around in weird rooms and it's raining or whatever. But there's, like, an element of mystery. Like, I want to watch this because I want to know whether that gets resolved. Like, I don't know why these people are here. I don't know really what they're doing. I don't really know what this place they're in is. Like, there's the element of mystery that sort of takes you through it. And some of that gets explained and some of it doesn't. And here was a bit like, oh, the guy's sad. You're like, okay. I don't mean, I'm trying to be unsympathetic, but I mean, it's a film. And sorry, I'm getting it into more sort of review territory, I guess, but I think a lot of it felt like more just dragged out in a way that Stalker doesn't. Stalker feels more like, oh, this kind of has to be like this, or it doesn't really work.
Yeah, I'd almost say it's Stalker if you sucked all of the sci-fi-ness out of it, and if you sucked out all of the kind of... Well, I don't even want to say all of the impending doom, because there's still some pretty heavy impending doom, but it's not the kind of, like, the zone might kill you. It's more like the, I don't know, just the existential heaviness of being alive.
It almost feels like, I don't know if this is true or not. Maybe I'll think about it and think that I regret saying this. It feels like more personal, but not universal. I guess the best films that feel personal to the characters and to the viewer. And it didn't feel like that applicable. It felt like this guy is clearly very distressed, sad, homesick, whatever. But I didn't really feel that necessarily. You're just kind of watching a distance, like someone else feel like that, rather than feeling particularly like engaged with that point, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's totally valid. On the finding it maybe slightly frustrating, I watched it a week ago and then I rewatched it earlier today, and I found I enjoyed it more the second time around. I found the slowness less frustrating, I think, because I already knew what was going to happen, so the lack of things happening was kind of like, that's fine, because I know how it does work out. So the, like, why don't you go somewhere faster wasn't bothering me. I mean, that is sort of a par for the course thing with Tarkovsky. You don't necessarily go to him for a bunch of exciting stuff.
No, maybe I just thought it was a bit self-indulgent. I don't know, because there was the second story, right? About this guy who like thinks that the apocalypse is there, and like why does he make this trip? Like, I found that plot much more interesting. Like, I wanted to, like, why is the film not about that guy? Really? Because it's kind of more like, oh, there's this other story going on, and really it's a metaphor for my sadness or loneliness, whatever. Like, not my, like, the main guy is. sadness
Yeah.
or loneliness. We're actually like, this is like an interesting thing to interrogate why people do this stuff. Things like why people think they can like live out the end of the world or whatever. Like, why do people make these choices? And you're like, none of that is really interrogated. It's more like, this guy was trapped and he trapped his family and now I feel trapped. You're like, okay, like I kind of get it, maybe. But it felt like there was this much more interesting plot that just wasn't, that was just used as a metaphor rather than like, I don't know, built on or like interrogated in an interesting way. But I'm sure that wasn't what Tarkovsky was trying to do. Like, I think it felt like that was an obvious choice, like not to do that. But
I have a quote that I quite liked from Jeff Dyer's book Zona, which is about Stalker, but he talks a little bit about nostalgia in there as well. And he didn't like Nostalgia as much as Stalker, and he said there are no one else's cliches in Tarkovsky. By the time of his final films, however, he is reliant both conceptually and incrementally on Tarkovskyan cliche. The guru became his own devoted disciple, which is quite harsh, but also
I maybe wouldn't
fair.
express it that harsh, but it does feel like that. It feels like, oh, here are the things I've got to be in my films, and maybe, and it's tricky to separate that between like different filmmakers, different artists of any kind of genre, like have a degree of a certain style. Like, of course, you're drawing on your own experiences, like you're drawing on other things, and so it's sort of absurd to be the opposite like that and be like, everything you do, every piece of art you make should be radically different from anything you've done before. But yeah,
the interesting thing
it does
is
seem like oddly.
Sorry, I talked over you there.
No. I was going to say, but so that, I mean, that's kind of absurd extreme, but yeah, maybe this does feel too like, I kind of want to do this thing again that's basically the same, but not really.
It's interesting though, because Tarkovsky himself, in an interview around the time, said that he thought that this was his favourite of his films and the one that was the best realised in terms of achieving what he set out to achieve. So it's maybe it was just he'd been wanting to do this before and felt like he'd only got like part of the way with Stalker. So.
I mean, I can see how it feels like it might feel very personal. Obviously, I can't talk for Tarkovsky, but it feels like quite a personal film, and so I sort of get how he might be like, this is a film that I really wanted to make, like that this connects with me, and it's kind of like, well, I guess that makes sense if it's the way that you were feeling. But I don't know whether part of filmmaking, like how much of filmmaking is like trying to communicate that to an audience, and how much of that is just like, this is the piece of art I wanted to make, like this is how I felt. Like, it doesn't really matter, really care too much about whether you get it or feel the same as a viewer. Like,
yeah, it's interesting. I re-listened to the episode of Classic Schmassic that I recorded with Chris and Owen years and years ago at this point about Solaris, and Owen had this really interesting way of describing Tarkovsky films, and he said on the episode he's kind of aware he's possibly making up a word here, but he called the film toneful, and I would say that this has that as well. Like, it's very like heavy in atmosphere,
definitely,
but that sometimes the atmosphere is like frustration and boredom that the characters are feeling, like projected sort of onto you. I detected a little bit of frustration from you towards the main character. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, it's probably unfair. It's probably unfair. It's just, I don't know. What am I saying?
I don't want to put you on the spot around that, but I wanted to bring it out because I felt a certain amount of that as well. I must admit, so I'm glad it wasn't just me, because there was an element of like, come on, man, you're Oleg Yankovsky, you're incredibly handsome and talented, and you're in Tuscany having... Well, you're clearly not having a nice time personally, but, you know, you're not very much is being asked of you. You're getting to hang out in these beautiful surroundings. Yes, you're a long way from your family, but that seems like it's a professional choice. So I feel like I'm being massively unsympathetic towards the character, and the thing, one has to try and be empathetic because you never know what else is going on. But there is an element of like, come on, man, like.
Yeah, no, I felt very similarly, and I feel like I'm being a hypocrite because I've said, I don't know whether in this podcast or just for casual conversations with people that like that I don't think all characters in kind of art or stories like should necessarily be sympathetic. That often you end up with boring films where like everyone is kind of meant to be a good person or whatever, and you're like, it's just kind of okay if things are complicated, if things are difficult. Like, it's not, the filmmaker is not necessarily saying that this person's great. Like, you should be able to make things that are about people that aren't okay or aren't particularly nice people. Like, it's okay. And yet to kind of just be like, oh yeah, this guy's just a bit of self-indulgent, isn't he? Like, it's like kind of felt similar. It's okay. Like, we've all felt sad in situations where certainly I have. Like, I'm sure most people have, in situations that feel like, oh, I should be having a nice time, and actually I feel a bit sad and I feel a bit lonely. So it's not that I think like, oh, he's wrong for feeling that way.
No,
but he doesn't come across very, and that is kind of weird to be like, oh, there's this other guy that's locked his family away for 7 years, and like to a point, you're like, I feel a little bit more sympathetic towards him. Like, not that that's a great thing to do.
No, it's
but
an
like,
awful thing.
Clearly this guy like has, like, this other guy has issues, and he obviously dealt with them in a terrible way. But you feel like he's probably got real problems. And sometimes it feels like this other guy doesn't really happen to have real problems, and he's sort of going, maybe I'm this guy that locked his family away, and you're like, I guess maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, but it is nice that they have that like moment of connection where they talk to each other, and Goncharov treats Domenico like a person who is, even though he's done terrible things, is still a worthwhile human, because everyone else is just so dismissive of him and just calls him a madman and insane, and it's just, and clearly he has some serious mental health.
Absolutely. But
and he's clearly done terrible things. But yeah, it's very pleasant to see Goncharov like doing something towards like acknowledging his humanity, even if it is perhaps for slightly self-indulgent and kind of odd projecting
that's fair.
Himself onto him. Yeah, I'm conflicted about it, but there's a nugget of something positive in there, I think. Speaking of characters who are not incredibly sympathetic, perhaps, how did you feel about the character Eugenia and how she's portrayed? Because I had strong feelings, but I want to hear yours first.
I feel like I'm going to say something wrong, seeing you've got strong feelings about it. I don't think she's particularly unsympathetic. It feels like the impression I got, because she's not in it that much, was that he hadn't treated her very well as a colleague or whatever. The details of that are kind of not necessarily given explicitly, but that was the sort of vibe I got, that this guy was being sort of wallowing in it and actually not really being very collaborative, for want of a better term. But so what are your strong opinions?
Yeah, so that's interesting, because you were definitely more sympathetic to not necessarily her, but the way she's portrayed than I was. Certainly the first time I watched it, and I think maybe watching it again, I was slightly more nuanced. And yeah, I think you're totally right to pick up on Goncharov not treating her well, because that's definitely like certainly a subtext. And even the first time we see them, it's not quite the first thing that happens in the film, but it's the first thing that happens in colour, where they pull up in, I think it's like a VW Beetle, and we hear them talking, and he tells her off for speaking to him in Russian. He wants to speak Italian, despite his Italian not being very good. So that's literally their first interaction, is him telling her off. And he says please, but his tone of voice is quite like gruff and grouchy. And so, yeah, that's, as a first interaction and an introduction to the two characters, yeah, he's not coming across at all well. Although I have to say, I brought some of my own experience of trying to be good at languages or another language besides English onto here, because I found, when I was living in Moscow, super frustrating that when I tried to speak Russian, Russians often would just speak back to me in English because they'd hear my accent, and I'd just be like, I wouldn't say this, and maybe I should have said it. It's just like, I want to practice my Russian. I'm never going to get any better if I can't practice. Please be patient with me. But I think for whatever reason, I didn't have the level of self-confidence or assertiveness to say, please can you indulge me and be patient with me and let me practice, because I want to be better at your language. So in my preparation for this episode, I read about half of the chapter on this film from Nariman Skakov's book on cinema of Tarkovsky, which is like subtitled Labyrinths in Space and Time, which, by the way, sounds like a prog metal album, but that's besides the point. Stop distracting yourself, Ali. He had a really interesting take on that, and he was saying that Goncharov was basically blocking Eugenia from trying to form any kind of intimacy with him by like preventing her from speaking his language to him. I mean, I read it as just like, no, he wants to get good at Italian and he doesn't feel like he's going to. But yeah, their relationship, we don't see that much of it, or there's quite a bit where they're spending time together, but it's in silence, and it's sort of like a freighted silence. But around my ambivalent feelings towards the character, I was wondering whether this was me just going, Tarkovsky often gets called out for not being the greatest at depicting women as like full people, and there was some stuff in here that happened that big scare quotes here where it's like hysterical, as I say, big scare quotes around hysterical behavior, because we have her doing the weird thing where she like decides to sprint in a very slippy corridor and while wearing high heels and falls over and then just kind of laughs maniacally, and that's kind of like, that's weird behavior. And then more later on in the film, there's the scene I think you've alluded to or like mentioned in passing already, where she comes into Goncharov's room and it seems like she's trying to come on to him, but then decides against it, and she like not to put too fine a point on it, she whips out one of her boobs and then gets upset and doesn't quite cry, but like shouts at him and saying he's the worst. And it's just kind of like this sort of it sort of felt like, okay, how did we haven't seen how she got to this clearly like very unhappy place, and without seeing the steps it feels a bit kind of icky and a bit like, women, what are they like?
It feels like Tarkovsky just isn't very interested in her as a character. It's like she's sort of here to represent a thing. Like, this guy can't really make relationships with people for whatever reason. I don't know, he's distracted, he's homesick, whatever. And it never feels like the film is really that interested in getting to know her as a person. So yeah, I think your critique is valid, that she doesn't feel like a very rounded human being.
And then I was thinking back to previous Tarkovsky films, like in Stalker's wife, she has that scene where she kind of has a bit of a fit and kind of writhes around on the floor, and it's a bit like, can we have some adult women characters behaving normally in a Tarkovsky film, please? Yeah. And like in Andrei Rublev, like the main female character that there is mute, so there's kind of like a, I don't know, maybe I'm overreading it. That said, on the rewatch, going in with like watching for like, is this character underdeveloped? I felt like slightly more nuance to it, because you have that scene it's very early on in the church where we see like the miracle with all of the birds flying out of the statue to the Virgin Mary. But before that happens, Eugenia has a conversation with, I think he's called the sacristan. I don't know enough about the Catholic Church and jobs within it to know exactly what that is, but she has this conversation with him, and he talks about women's role in a very kind of traditionalist and sort of patriarchal way, and she calls him out on it and says, do you really think that's all women should aspire to? And he's kind of like, well, you asked me what I thought, and he's quite defensive and kind of backs off because he realises he's possibly being kind of rude to her. But I thought it was good that the film has the self-awareness to allow that character to say that.
Yeah.
So on the rewatch, it made me go, okay, maybe Tarkovsky isn't quite as bad in this area as he's made out to be, or at least there's some nuance there. Anyway, that was my whole bit on Eugenia. I did notice that Goncharov's wife is basically silent in the whole film because we only see her in flashbacks. And I think she says like one word, which is Andrei. So it's like she's almost silent. So that, again, it's kind of like maybe that says more about the character of Andrei in the film rather than the filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky. But it was just, I don't know. It's once it's been pointed out to you, it's kind of hard not to see it.
Yeah. Oh no, it does feel like that the female characters are generally underdeveloped, or I don't know, parody was the wrong word, but you know what I mean, like it's almost sort of archetypes, like they're either that they're not fully rounded people.
Yeah, and his Andrei's flashback wife is very kind of barefoot and at one point literally pregnant. so it's kind of like yeah. It's interesting that she's called Maria, though. That feels very significant considering we have the stuff around the Virgin Mary. There's a lot about faith in this film, which again ties it back in with Stalker. And also like the sort of holy fool type Russian archetype, because that definitely feels like what Domenico is, maybe.
Yeah, I can see how you might read it that way. It's definitely not the way that Andrei is.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that in his final scene, Domenico, before he self-immolates in a
of course,
very,
I forgot to mention that very end bit.
Very upsetting denouement. He gives this big speech, which some of it feels like incoherent ramblings, but he says a line something like, it's the, I as a mad person am saying this, but it's the sane people in this world that have brought us to the brink of of the end of the world, or so, it's not. I'm not paraphrasing it very well, but I am thinking, wow, this film came out in '83, so at the time it was being made, you had the heating up of the Cold War and Reagan and Brezhnev, and then later, what was the one who came after Brezhnev? I'm drawing a blank on that. I'll fill that in later. But basically, there was this heating up of the Cold War, and when you see pop culture from that time, there is this feeling of like, okay, is nuclear war just around the corner? Mm-hmm. So thinking of the film being made in that atmosphere, and then also watching it now and thinking about climate change, it's like, yeah, the people who are important and in charge and supposed to be doing something about this do not seem to be. So there's kind of yes, this character has mental health problems and has done some really bad things, but back to that holy fool thing, sometimes it's the people who don't have their mental health together who sometimes end up saying things that need to be heard. So I'm not sure how coherent I've been with that, but yeah, that really stood out. Certainly second watch around. Also, incidentally, while we're talking about the end of the world, again, in the Nariman Skakov book that I read, he said that this plus Stalker and The Sacrifice can be read as like an apocalyptic trilogy, and I was like, yeah, I feel like I should have seen that, but it's one of those, once it's pointed out to you, it's like, yep, there's definitely a lot to be said for that observation. I feel like I've just talked at you for like solidly for the last like 10-15 minutes.
It's fine. I feel like you have more insightful things to say about metaphors or something.
No. Yeah, was there anything that we haven't talked about so far that you wanted to get into?
We got to talk about how beautiful some of the cinematography is, but there you go.
It's gorgeous.
So many great pans. So many pans where it starts thing and then it moves and then it ends up on one of the other characters and all kinds of things. There's just a lot of really lovely, very thoughtful, very considered camera movement. That's just really. I was going to say it's a film that's not like happy at all ever. It's not even. I don't know whether it's even beautiful. Like, it's pretty depressing and bleak most of it. But there's just a lot of really like considered camera work and stuff that really like makes that, I don't know, what were you saying, meditative or whatever, like flow work really well.
Oh, definitely. Like, as you say, despite the bleakness of the subject matter, there's something so beautiful about the framing and the lighting, and the thoughtfulness of how it's being put together. It does make it, like, it's not entertaining in any conventional sense, but it is quite just pleasurable aesthetically. It does feel like looking at like a beautiful painting, except it's moving. It's not one single still. It's that painting, but moving ever so slightly. I mean, sometimes it's almost imperceptible. Sometimes it's slightly faster, but yeah. And the lighting sometimes, this feels quite flippant, but it almost feels like it's like almost like film noirish with like the light and dark contrasts, and maybe like, again, it's in Italy. Let's throw in an Italian reference, like a Caravaggio painting, like with just some of the lighting choices. There were a couple of times where they're sitting in an almost dark room, and I'm thinking, why doesn't someone just turn on the light? And then someone literally does. It almost feels like Tarkovsky has like a slight sense of humor about what he's doing. But yeah, there's so many compositions where it just is breathtakingly beautiful. So not fun, but still enjoyable on that level.
Yeah, definitely.
And if this isn't breaking our listeners' aura of mystery around you, Lyn, do you mind if I drop the fact that you're a photographer, so you have a particularly keen eye for this stuff?
Yeah, I'm worried that my opinions will be more judged now, but yeah. So, but yeah, it's a beautiful film to look at. Yeah, and I love a mysterious room that's too big. It's just an aesthetic that I crave.
Definitely. And rooms that have mysterious puddles. I think that was
also that.
It's like
it's so wet. It's such a wet film. It's like if it's not raining, it's just foggy. I mean, with the exception, which it's when they move to Rome at the end, it feels notable. It's not even like it's beautifully sunny in Rome. It's like pretty overcast, but it just feels so much notably drier than when they're in the village and like it's just damp. It's just constantly damp.
Yeah, and it just I have noticed it before, but when this and Stalker, they're just such damp films. And then actually there's a big like raining sequence in Andrei Rublev as well. So it's just it's clearly something he enjoys. That said, you've got quite a lot of fire in this too. And again, I don't know whether this is Tarkovsky having a dark sense of humor or what he was trying to say, but we get like a match cut between Domenico on fire and kind of going out like Denethor. Sorry, that's really flippant and
they're fictional characters. It's okay.
They are fictional characters. It's okay. I think. You have going from Domenico like burning on the floor to then we cut to Goncharov lighting his lighter, and it's just like that's a match cut. It's like that's a bit jarring. Is that it feels sort of like a dark joke. I don't know. And this I don't know how I didn't spot this the first time, but like in terms of like dark stuff, the bit where we see just as Domenico has covered himself in petrol, we see this figure on the ground who's just like miming.
Yeah, that was weird. That was
so
the one thing that I feel like was that instant what I felt was the most disturbing part of the film. I feel like because it's so like not examined. There's lots of like other disturbing things, like the guy locking his family away and all that kind of stuff. But they're sort of more explicit. They're kind of explained to a point. I know I complained there wasn't enough explanation of it, but at least you're given some kind of context to what happened. But yeah, then there's just some guy being like, "Oh yeah, just light yourself on fire." But
it's so sinister.
It's very
so
sinister,
awful.
yeah.
Like, and then of course the police show up way too late. And there seems like there's a sort of almost like, again, maybe I'm reading too much into it, like an absurdist kind of comedy to the fact that like, the music won't even work in that scene. So it just, it's supposed to be the Ode to Joy, which again, super dark juxtaposition with what we're seeing on screen, but the fact that it's like cutting in and out and warped, and it just feels like something about this character that he's like so hapless that even his like grand exit doesn't quite go according to plan. So that feels like, again, I don't know, like there's some maybe a like dark comedy to that. I don't know, I feel like I'm dwelling on this scene too much, but it's just so disturbing that it's really stuck with me.
Yeah, it was very effective. And the way that everyone is just, it's kind of like a crowd scene, but everyone is still, and everyone is like artfully distributed on steps and stuff. Like no one's clustered, like in a real crowd. Like you cluster people that you know, and people are moving and stuff. Like everyone is just standing just in the right, in inverted commas,
Yeah, and it's
kind of
interesting in
artful place to be.
And it's interesting in terms of the rest of the film, in that there's a separation between things that are in black and white are typically or implicitly they're memories and or dreams or imaginings, whereas this is meant to be ostensibly something that's happening in real life, and yet that there's this unreal element, as you say, with the people being distributed in a very kind of choreographed and just non-naturalistic way, which I don't know, maybe that's a commentary on just like the unreality or horror of what's about to occur. There's also just like why is no one doing something to intervene? And the fact that you literally have someone like handing up the petrol can, I'm just like, this is not good. And I'm not wanting to advocate a situation where there are just like authorities and police everywhere to stop things like this happening, but there also is like please someone stop this from happening, this is awful.
Well, like you say with the choreographed kind of people, it's like no one even just shouts that he should stop or something. Like there's just like nothing, like everyone's just standing there almost kind of observing but sort of disinterestedly, in a kind of weird way, and I suppose it's a commentary on something. Are we meant to read this as a commentary on like modern society and people not looking out for each other or particularly caring what's happening or not feeling invested in the lives of people around them? And I mean, in a way, it's maybe it's impossible to be a good neighbour to everybody in the way that one would want to be. But yeah, this feels like that's just like a super stark drawing attention to that of like, no, someone should help that guy. Someone should not be helping that guy do what he's going to do. Sorry, this is heavy. No, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
I still think the film should have been an hour and a half though. But
I mean, there's an argument that a lot of films would benefit from being 90 minutes rather than 120. So another stylistic choice that I've noticed or found out about Tarkovsky since I last talked about one of his films on here is his use of this device called a rückenfigur.
Okay.
So that's like when you see a figure from the back, it's like from the German, and there's a lot of it in Stalker, and there's a lot of it in this as well. And I wasn't not the biggest art history buff in the world. This was something I wasn't aware of until last year. I went to an exhibition at Milton Keynes gallery of Boyd and Evans.
What a great exhibition.
Did you see that one?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, I should have known you of all the people I know. I nearly said you of all people, which sounded like unnecessarily sinister. But choose my words carefully. That of all the people I know who would have seen that it was a great exhibition, wasn't it? Yes,
it was great.
But anyway, I was there, and I was noticing that they use this device, this rückenfigur device, a lot, and I didn't know that's what it was called. I just was looking at a lot of their works because they do combination. Well, it's painting, but often it's like a combination of photography or photographs they've taken that they then paint. But I was seeing these figures from the back a lot, and just going, this seems very Tarkovskyan, and I was thinking, is this just me projecting my preoccupations onto this art, or is there something genuinely there? And I can't remember. I either asked the guide or looked at like one of the descriptions, or looked it up later, and I found that there is this thing in visual art, rückenfigurs. It like comes from or it's particularly prominent in like German romantic paintings of the 19th century, where you see someone from the back and it's kind of around portraying a figure in the wilderness. And it was it was just really interesting how he uses those. And I think, I don't know, I'm still learning about them and what they're for, and whether they're for identifying with the character or creating distance, and I just thought it was cool, and I wanted to talk about it, and now I have. But yeah, if you want to talk about more about that exhibit, having seen it as well, because I would love to talk about that.
To remember it, I love Boyd and Evans stuff, and I should caveat that with I don't really like their photography that much, but I love all their paintings, because a lot of the time they use photographs as reference, and then often combine different photographs by painting elements from different photographs into one scene that effectively ends up being fictional, but it has these elements that are taken very much like from life and are painted in a realistic manner, in these sort of slightly fantastic, but not very fantastic, just fantastic enough kind of compositions that I don't know, it's just really interesting. I just think their stuff is really great. But I mean, we grew up in Milton, both of us grew up in Milton Keynes, and so much of their work relates to that kind of modernist. I don't know, like some of their work relates to Milton Keynes specifically, but that sort of new town, like, I don't really know what to say. The sort of liminal space, that's a very cliched word to use. Things like half built and that kind of thing. It's yeah.
And also maybe that sort of utopian, like, but maybe utopian in theory, but maybe dystopian in practice. Kind of,
yeah. I've never,
because they're quite optimistic. Actually, like,
I do feel like a lot of their work is fairly optimistic, but there is a certain realist edge to it. Like within this utopian sort of work, there is a certain, all their stuff does have a little element that's like, I don't know. I guess it's aspirational to a point, but it does have an edge that reality does intrude into these utopias.
Yeah,
it's certainly not purely. What a great vision this thing is. Like, yeah,
because if you weren't looking at it closely, it could almost seem like socialist realism for the 80s.
yeah, definitely.
Because I mean, they're still continuing to work. I think they're in their like mid to late 70s now, but like some of their more famous stuff is from the 80s, and it looks so 80s in terms of the fashion, and you could see it as being kind of like, yeah, like overly optimistic, but if you're looking at it carefully, you kind of notice things that are like either slightly off or like slightly kind of humorous or playful. This isn't about Tarkovsky at all. It's just
no. I read a review of that exhibition, and the review was like, oh yeah, that's that one of them people kissing an underpass, and like it's such like a devastating takedown of like modern architecture and how like bleak and dystopian it is, and you're like, that's just not how I read it at all.
No,
like I don't think it's the opposite. I don't think they're saying like this is a utopian dream and isn't it brilliant, but like I just feel like it's so much more nuanced than that. Like it's not that obviously this reviewer had read in it, and like maybe they're right, I don't know, like had read in it that actually this was all like, oh, it comes across like that, but really it's just a takedown and like of how dystopian and horrible and everything is. And I just can't, I know, like looking at the context of the rest of the work, I just can't really believe that is the intent.
Yeah, or indeed projecting cliches about Milton Keynes onto it and just going, oh yeah, it's a hellscape.
yeah.
Which,
yeah,
believe me, I've lived there for a big chunk of my life, and there are some distinctly non-ideal things about it. Like, it's far too centered around the car to be particularly healthy, but there's also great stuff about it as well. So I like the fact that they sort of celebrate the best version of the place, but also without it slipping into just being like propaganda for like new towns.
That's it. I feel like they really ride that line between propaganda that isn't propaganda if you take more than a second to look at it. Without also, at the same time, it's not a total inversion. It's not a total bleak dystopian vision.
Yeah.
Anyway, interesting. Boyd and Evans, recommend. Interesting.
Yeah, and to kind of tie it back to the film, maybe, because the interesting thing about them as artists is that they weren't originally from the area. They were from London, but then moved out to Milton Keynes in the early 80s, and then just kind of liked the place and stayed. So,
because a lot of their other work that's non-Milton Keynes based is from the United States, from and a lot of that comes across as that sort of, I don't know, like that American dream sort of idealistic kind of thing, but it's never painted in that. It's not so obvious, you know. It's not necessarily idealistic, and yet there's clearly something about it that they find interesting and captivating.
Yeah, so my tying it back to the film is that I think they share with Tarkovsky, like, the ability in this film, the ability to see a place through the eyes of someone who hasn't spent their whole life there, and therefore can kind of see some of the interesting angles to it that would just be, to the eyes of a local, just completely commonplace and just wouldn't notice because that's just their day to day. And I think the other thing I would say they share with Tarkovsky maybe is like a confidence in their art to like not make the meaning obvious and to leave lots of space to kind of you as the viewer or the person contemplating it to kind of project your own experience onto it. Like there's so much space to do that, and I think I really like the idea of it being like a sort of a co-creative process, like you're almost being invited to use the art as a jumping off point for your own thoughts, and some of the slowness and the space allows you to do that. Now, I should say, I don't know whether that's the intention of either Tarkovsky or Boyd and Evans, but it feels like space is being left to do that, and I like that. That is my reaction. Oh, what a joyously neat segue that was.
I thought it was pretty good.
Oh, thank you. You're very kind. Do I have anything in my notes that I wanted to talk about that I haven't talked about yet? I think I maybe have one thing. Before I do my last call, do you have any last calls?
I don't think so.
Cool.
Is there anything else you wanted to talk about after that?
Yeah, so it's more of a anecdote that I quite enjoyed, because the film makes quite a lot about how different Russia and Italy are, and particularly Goncharov has a bit of a rant about translation and how it's a total waste of time, and how you shouldn't translate poetry because it will never capture it. And Eugenia retorts, like, how would we know Pushkin and Tolstoy if someone hadn't bothered to translate?
Yeah.
And, you know, even if you're not capturing the entire essence, it doesn't mean it's a waste of time. And then she says, like, you know, likewise with Petrarch and Dante and Machiavelli, like, Russians have benefited from the fact that there are Russian translations of those Italian works. So I like her effort for saying, like, actually, this is still a worthwhile endeavour, even if it's imperfect. And then he responds by saying, like, I think all borders should be abolished. And I was like, yes, you're actually right about that one. That's a heck of a thing to just drop into a conversation and then not interrogate, but I'm not going to interrogate it anyway. I anticipate the 1-star reviews for my podcast with gladness. So that was sort of what I wanted to talk about. But as far as that difference, supposedly, like that gaping chasm between Italy and Russia that Goncharov seems to think is there and seems to make him feel so homesick. Before this project was a podcast, I interviewed the writer Mike Walker, and he said something quite amusing, or recounted something quite amusing. The director of BBC radio programmes, particularly dramas, Sasha Yevtushenko, who himself is the son of the poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, apparently said that that Russians are really Italian stuck in the snow, which I loved as a comparison, because having lived there for a long time, there is this kind of like the stereotype of the kind of the public face, and it being very kind of like frowny face and kind of inscrutable, like don't wear your emotions on your sleeve for like very obvious historical reasons. But then once you actually get to know people, they're very demonstrative and, you know, passionate in the way that sort of stereotypically, you know, we all know what the Italian stereotypes are, of being, you know, very vociferous and lots of hand gestures. Yeah, that I really liked that comparison, because I thought, yeah, that does ring a bell. That sort of living life in a very full-on sort of way. Again, national stereotypes. Stereotyping is generally bad. It's not helpful, but there's often a grain of truth to it at the same time. I'm trying to have my cake and eat it. Speaking of national stereotypes, that's reminding me, like, this has, like, the moment where Goncharov is in that, like, ruined church that's, like, waterlogged, and then he's just drinking imported vodka that has, like, Latin letters on it from a plastic cup. I'm kind of like, wow, we're hitting the Russian stereotypes here pretty hard, both Andreis. So that was a moment of kind of like, yeah, that's leaning into the stereotypes there. But anyway, it's sort of, it's an incredibly depressing image, but also kind of humorous on the maybe Tarkovsky slightly poking fun of national stereotypes at the same time. Yeah, that was my last call and or observations. Did you have anything else?
I don't think so. No, thank you for getting me to watch it. Even though I think it's the Tarkovsky film that I've enjoyed the least. I'm still glad that I watched it.
Great, because I was going to say, like, would you recommend this to people? That seems like a.
I don't know. Maybe if they really like other Tarkovsky films.
That's like a qualified no. I mean, I think
I guess it's a qualified no. I feel like if people have watched other Tarkovsky films and were like, oh yeah, like, would you say that I should just finish it up, you know, watch the rest or whatever? You'd be like, sure. But if someone was like, oh, I want to watch Tarkovsky film, is this the one you recommend? Like, probably not.
Yeah, I would say if you've not seen a Tarkovsky film before, if you do decide to make this your first Tarkovsky experience, do know that you're throwing yourself into, like, the maximalist version of Tarkovsky.
Yeah, I feel the only thing it's got going for it is that it's shorter than some other Tarkovsky films. I don't mean that's the only thing it's got going for it as a film. I mean, like, as a first recommendation to somebody
as
for
a
a
starting
Tarkovsky
point.
film.
Okay.
Yeah.
Important clarification.
Yeah.
Yes, because, I mean, as we've already covered in detail, it is beautiful to look at.
Yeah, and it definitely has a tone, as you were saying earlier. Like, that's very much true. It's not that nothing hits.
Yeah. So, if one was starting with Tarkovsky, then where would your starting point be? Would you?
Well, I've only seen 3. But
that's
caveat,
right.
I don't know. Just watch Stalker. It's cool.
Yeah.
Or just watch the last hour of Andrei Rublev. I know I've said that before on this podcast. You can skip the previous 2 hours or whatever, because that film was long. But
Yeah, sorry, I set you up to fail there. I think I would, having seen 6 out of 7 now, I think I would say probably Stalker or Solaris would be good starting points as to seeing like Tarkovsky in quite a representative of his shtick way, but those films are both very long, so if you're wanting something that's a bit more of a accessible runtime, then Ivan's Childhood, because it's 90 minutes, but it's not as, he hasn't found the things that he likes as much as he will subsequently, so I would kind of say the kind of median recommendation is one of those two sci-fi adaptations. So awesome.
I told someone to watch A Russian Youth the other day, so this podcast
oh,
has
amazing!
done
Yeah, someone can find that. Yeah,
it's
that. Yeah,
it was bleak. I don't know. He said that he was into like bleak war films, and he'd already seen Come and See. So,
yeah,
like, you've done the worst. Now you can see things that are almost, but not quite as bleak.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. Now I'm having flashbacks to A Russian Youth, and yes, because I nearly said that was Alexander Sokurov, but it's not. It's out of his. It was under his. I think he was a producer on that film, because the reason I mention him is because he had, I think quite a close connection with Tarkovsky, and I think some film critics have described him almost like as a disciple of Tarkovsky, and he made like a tribute film which I haven't seen yet called Moscow Elegy. But anyway, that's a tangent-ish. But yeah, no, I'm glad that you brought that film up, because it is. I don't know. I definitely see the connective tissue between those two films in terms of aesthetics.
Yeah, it's obviously been a while since I saw it. Like, it feels stronger narratively than a lot of Tarkovsky things. It's slightly less of a tone piece. I guess it's just more explicit with its narrative, but it does have a lot of like longer shots where no one really talks very much through the whole film.
Yeah, like leaning into the visuals and going, hey, we're a film. We can just show you stuff rather than having to talk at you.
I think that does share those kind of things with a lot of Tarkovsky films.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks, Lyn, for coming back on the show. It's been so good to have a conversation with you again about films. Before we land this plane... Why am I going with that metaphor? I don't know. Before we bring this episode into land, are there any films that you've seen recently besides this one that you would like to tell us about / recommend / tell me about?
I feel like I've not seen very many films. The only recommendation I had is we're watching it a lot, and it's kind of vaguely Soviet related. We were watching For All Mankind, the TV series. It is extremely silly. It starts off, the first series is like, oh yeah, we're kind of a serious drama. And then by the second series, it's kind of rapidly given up on this and has become a soap opera in space. Space
soap.
Yeah.
Something.
It's if you just let that go for a moment, because I found that a little hard, going like, oh, I thought this was more of a serious science fiction thing or whatever. If you just kind of let that go and just lean into it, that it's really a big character piece, and the most dramatic thing that can happen is what happens all of the time. It's very enjoyable. The premise is, and this happens 10 minutes into the first episode, so I'm not really spoiling much. The premise is, what if the Soviets landed on the moon first? And then it just continues on there. By the time we've just started season 4, it's got to 2003. Each series skips ahead like 8 or 9 years. But yes, the space race continues in this alternate history. And yeah, it's real fun. People are doing acting. Occasionally people have terrible aging prosthetics. But I'm not trying to say this ironically that it's bad. It's very enjoyable. It's just like becomes not quite. When first I started watching it, it feels like it's going to be slightly more serious than it ends up taking itself. But it's it's very fun. It's very fun.
Awesome. Well, you're not the first person who has told me that I really need to check it out, and so yes, it's moving up the watch list. And I must say, yeah, I do really like it when, with TV series, they can evolve into something different, and sometimes it can be quite a long way from the original conception. And also, I think it sounds like it would work well as a good film palette cleanser if you've just sat through a slightly disturbing art film by a renowned but maybe not necessarily known for his sense of humour Russian director. So it has that going for it as well. Okay. Well, thanks again, Lyn. This has been awesome. And
thank you very much. This has been a pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah, we should do this again sooner than the gap between the last time. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you, dear listener, for listening, and arrivederci, folks.
Arrivederci.
Changing it up. Bye.
Bye.
And so the credits roll, and that's it for another episode of the Russian and Soviet Movie Podcast. This episode starred me, Ali Pitts, and my amazing guest, Lyn Seren. It turns out that this was Lyn's 12th appearance on this show. If you've listened to all of those and would like to hear even more of our waffling, we also did a track-by-track podcast on the music of REM called Gentlemen Don't Get Caught. That project is currently on hiatus, but we did get as far as the New Adventures in Hi-Fi album, so that's a lot of episodes for you to enjoy. You'll find a link to those in the show notes for this episode. The intro music for this show is from the song Cold by Sasha Ilukovich and the Highly Skilled Migrants. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support this ongoing movie curation / celebration / whatever project, there are a whole bunch of ways you can do that. The best, most helpful thing you can do is tell fellow film and or history folks about it, whether that's in person or by leaving a review on your podcast player of choice. I'm not going to give the green one or the fruit-based one free advertising here, but if you use either of those, a positive rating or review would be amazing, as would a rating or review on whatever other app you may use. As you'll appreciate, we're arguably a little bit niche, so we need all the help we can get in making sure that folks who'd be interested in what we do actually find out that we exist. Another really helpful and free way to support me and my film-related endeavours would be following me on Letterboxd and liking my reviews and lists on there. As well as making this show, I like to listen to a lot of other movie podcasts, so I often link to episodes I've enjoyed in my reviews on there. My handle on Letterboxd is Ali_Pitts, that's ALLY_PITTS. Again, it's in the show notes. For all the info you're ever likely to want or need about the show, please go to our Linktree. That's Linktree/Russian Soviet Movie Podcast, which, yes, again, it's in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, take care, and bye for now.
I then might clip that audio there. I'm sorry, I got a bit enthusiastic.
That's all right. Oh my goodness, I'm so rusty at this. Oh,
it's fine. It's fine.
I think I've also just reached a certain amount of I still like podcasting, but I don't care that much if it isn't perfect, which I think was a problem for years and years and years.
Yeah, I think that's a good balance to strike between you don't want it to be awful, but at the same time,
yes,
like,
at the same time, like
about tiny things that don't matter.
Yeah, being a perfectionist is just a recipe for
for not actually doing things.
Yeah, and or doing things and just making yourself perpetually unhappy about them, and just being like spending hours and hours in the editing booth. Not that I have a booth, but the metaphor, the hypothetical or the figurative. That's the word I'm looking for. Anything we need to chat through before we launch back into